Well now, good day to you friends. Seamus here. Thank you for joining me again this week. Today we're going to share a 5-minute fable. A short, simple, sweet story. I hope it brings you a bit of joy. I don't want to waste any time today with fancy introductions. Let's just share the old story of the sun and the north wind. Once upon a time, a young father was walking his way home from work. Things had been very difficult in the small village that he had lived in, and he had had no choice but to take work on a farm on the far side of the neighboring shire. And it was far enough away that in the whole long growing season, he had only seen his family one time, and he couldn't wait to get home. Well, summer had passed and we were beginning to turn into autumn, and the farmer that he worked for had the crops in, and he paid the young father, and he released him from his work and sent him on his way. So the very next morning he rose up early, threw a blanket over his shoulder for the cool early autumn breeze, set it with a pin on his shoulder, took up his bag, and off he went down the road. And he walked and he walked and he walked, and he knew it was going to be a long day of nothing but walking and thinking about home. But at the end of the day, he would be home, and that gave him all the energy he needed. Well, as he went walking along down the road and the morning was beginning to wear away, he started to think about how fickle the weather was being that day. It seemed one moment the sun shone brightly and warmed his brow, and the next minute the wind was blowing right in his face and fluttering his hat. And he didn't know what to make of it. He just thought it was a funny thing about nature. What mattered is that he was on the way home. Well, what he didn't know was that at that very moment, as he trudged down that long forest path, is that the old north wind and fine old Mr. Sun were actually having a bit of a dispute. They were arguing about which one was more powerful. The wind was bragging about how he could knock down trees and lift the roofs off of houses, and the sun was simply saying, I make things grow and I keep people warm. And they argued and argued until finally they both looked down and noticed our young father walking along the path. And the sun said to the north wind, he says, well, there you have it. Why don't we do this? Let us accept the fact that whoever can make that young traveler remove his cloak will be the stronger of the two of us. And old North Wind thought for a moment, and he looked at Mr. Sun, and he growled, it's a bet. And immediately he set to work. It had been an intermittently breezy day, as we know, but that moment he turned his face towards the young traveler, and he blew a strong breeze right into the face of the young man. And all the young man did was just shift his shoulders a little bit and pull his cloak a little bit tighter. Well, Mr. North Wind was not happy about that, and he gathered his breath even more, and he began to bring in some clouds around him and blot out the sun a little bit and cool things off, and he gave an even stronger breath right at the young man. Oh, and the young man squinted his eyes and tipped his head down and kind of rucked his shoulders down into the blanket and pulled the cloak even tighter. And this went on for several minutes until finally the north wind had brought in a great, huge thundercloud, and he had brought down a smattering of rain and even a few bits of hail, maybe even a flake or two of snow. And gathering his energy, he gave the most powerful blast that he could, right into the young man's face. And no matter what he did, no matter how strong his breeze, no matter how wet the wind, all the young man did was hunker into the blanket closer and closer and closer, wanting to just get off the road and get home. And he just kept trudging down the road to home. Well, after a moment, the north wind looked at the sun and shrugged his shoulders and kind of yielded the floor, so to speak. And Mr. Sun stepped up and he began to shine a little bit on the young man, and they saw him relax and walk a little taller and shake himself out. And the north wind pulled back the clouds a little bit so the sun shone a bit brighter, and the young man kind of dabbed his brow a bit. And a few moments later, the clouds were almost gone, and the young man actually undid the pin on his cloak and just let the blanket sit loose over his shoulders. And this continued as the sun got warmer and warmer, and the clouds went further and further away until finally the warmth of the sun was so much that the young man actually took off his hat, and taking a handkerchief from his haversack, he mopped his brow and replaced his hat, thinking, this day has just gotten warmer and warmer. Finally, Mr. Sun turned a glance towards the old north wind, and leaning back to the young man, he smiled and gave the full radiance of his warm, warm sun. And the young man got so warm that in a heartbeat, he flicked that blanket off of his shoulders and knew that if he did not have a moment's rest, he may faint along the way and never make it home. And with that, the young man grabbed the blanket, stepped off the road into the shade of a tall pine tree, and sat himself down in the shadows, deciding that he would wait until the beginning of sunset before he made his way home. While with the cloak removed from his shoulders and the young man seeking shade, Mr. Sun turned to Mr. North Wind, and the North Wind acknowledged that clearly the Sun was the stronger of the two, and never again would he challenge his friend Mr. Sun about this very silly question. Well, the day went on. It was early autumn, as we said, and it wasn't long before Mr. Sun began to settle himself down into the very tops of the trees. And seeing the beginning of the setting of the sun, the young man got up, threw his cloak back over his shoulders, stepped back up onto the road, and finished the last wee bit of his walk home. He arrived at his village just as the last golden rays of the sun tickled golden across the field. And walking up to the door of his humble cottage, he pushed the door open and was warmly greeted by his wife and his children. And within moments, they all sat down to supper. And while they sat there that day enjoying the meal, the young farmer looked across the table, saw the smiles of his wife and his children, thought about how lovely it was to just walk in the sunshine on the way home, and knowing that he was home and safe, and his family was provided for, the young man took great joy in knowing that surely they would all live happily ever after. I do thank you for joining us today for this short story. I bid you peace as you go through your week. Feel free, of course, to like the video here on Facebook, subscribe, hit the bell, share it with your friends, all those things. Buy me a coffee if you want. The link's down below in the comments. But more importantly, join us again in just about a week's time when we'll have another tale to bring a smile and maybe a bit of joy. Until then, take good care of yourselves and of each other, and we will see you soon. Cheers.